sub-Saharan Africa. For an example of an export, there's lots of analysis looking at the impacts of droughts and floods and so forth on production and so forth. Way less input because it's less analysis because it's really hard to do. I'm trying to get a handle, particularly at a regional or global level, on the incidence of pests and diseases and their impact on yields and productivity. So we've been doing a lot of very detailed work with some colleagues here at CSIRO and elsewhere on trying to develop, like we have these maps of where in the world the crop, trying to develop maps of what is the likelihood of occurrence or the probability of occurrence of key pests and diseases worldwide for major crops, for the Gates project. Here is some data of stem rust, crop loss estimates back into the early part of the 20th century in the US. And you can see, as you track along from the 1920s and you get up to the late 60s, the measured losses stop because we actually invented notions of durable rust resistance at that point in time, and the breeders have been able to keep one step ahead of the bug. But these losses are huge. So you look at that, and the US looks like a developing country. We're talking 20, 30, 50% yield losses in some of these years as a consequence of this disease. Big spatial differences in both the frequency of occurrence and the magnitude of the losses. So in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, prime real estate for stem rust, head down to Texas and Oklahoma, less so. Why worry about, just because I live in Minnesota now, why might the world want to worry about those with respect to wheat production? Just to calibrate your views of the wheat world, if you look at Minnesota, North Dakota and South Dakota, they account just those three states alone for about 3/4 of the entire Australian crop. And if you just look at Kansas and North Dakota, that's equivalent to the entire Australian crop. So if something happens with respect to wheat production in those states, that's going to have a measurable impact on world wheat production and impact the global commodity prices and so forth. Well, it turns out with this modelling work we've been doing, we haven't published these yet, but we're pretty close to getting these released. We now have maps and views of the world about the probability of occurrence. So the darker the green, you get up to a higher probability of occurrence of stripe rust, leaf rust, and stem rust worldwide. Very big spatial differences in the probability of occurrence of these crops. And if you just to give you an indication about how potentially important this is with respect to likely crop losses worldwide, if you just take our stem rust maps and overlay them on our maps of where in the world is wheat, we estimate that about 16% of the entire world's wheat crop is vulnerable to an infestation of stem rust. Australia less so, sub-Saharan Africa highly so. So 60% of the wheat area in sub-Saharan Africa is vulnerable to an infestation of stem rust. If you look at the world not through this area lens as I was talking about earlier, but through a production lens, so I showed this data to Gates and showed them the top half, and they got very excited thinking about it. So if we're worrying about livelihoods of farmers and so forth in sub-Saharan Africa, you really want to worry wheat farmers about stem rust occurrence, perhaps less so with respect to in the US. But if you're worried about issues of global commodity prices, a much higher share of the world's global production coming out of the US is susceptible to stem rust, even though a smaller area share is susceptible. And you might want to worry about this. There's a little variant of stem rust called UG99, which was discovered in Uganda in 1999, and that's inching its way, has inched its way out of Uganda, and it's found its way into Kenya, and it's found its way into Ethiopia, and it's found its way into Yemen. And none of the world's bread wheats, or effectively none of the world's bread wheats, have any resistance to this form of stem rust. If that thing keeps moving over the Fertile Crescent top and starts heading down into India, which it seems to be doing, we're in potential trouble. So there's a big race going on now to try and breed in resistance to this particular version of stem rust. I was talking with colleagues at FAO a couple of weeks ago, and it turns out there's now a confirmed case of UG99 in South Africa. And they've been doing a bunch of analysis, and these are fungal spores get distributed in the upper atmosphere at 30 to 40,000 feet, and they've been looking at prevailing wind patterns, and it looks like the historical incidence of stem rust in Australia is highly correlated to outbreaks in South Africa, and one of the ways that you infect a crop is through rain. So you might have been worrying about the problems of rain with respect to forcing growth in the heads and so forth, but we may actually, as we speak, be infecting the Australian wheat crop with UG99. Final couple of slides here. So it seems to me, as I say, getting more explicit about modelling these biological or natural inputs into agriculture, at least from my perspective, is a way of understanding perhaps some of the drivers of future productivity performance. So a world resistant to UG99 is going to give us a very different performance in terms of wheat productivity going forward than a world that is not resistant to UG99. Confounding all of these views in terms of our long-run views of climate change and so forth is the fact that agriculture is very mobile. In these two left panels here is some work by Navin Ramakati and other colleagues, which is a model view of where in the world agriculture was back in 1700 vis-a-vis 2000. And it's the centred area under cultivation in each of these pixels then and now. And if you take the world then as our centre of the universe, which we've done on the right-hand side graph, and plotted what's called the centroid of production, continent by continent by continent, that is sort of the geographical pivot point of where agriculture is in Latin America and Australia and so forth, you can see that over this sweep of time, there's big spatial movements in the location of production. So we're talking in North America, northward, westward push in agriculture over this period of time. Ditto in Australia, with more of a northward push than the US. If you look at South America, you can see that over this period of time, agriculture in South America moved south, and then as the Cerrado started to develop and so forth in the 1950s, the centroid of production started moving north. So if we think these natural inputs have a high site specificity, and we know that agriculture moves over the landscape, this makes it doubly difficult to actually try and disentangle issues of the role of natural inputs on production and productivity performance. Now, as I mentioned, we see exactly the same thing going on within countries as we see between countries. So my student Jason put together a really remarkable set of data, and you can see that back in 1880, this is the share of maize production in the US that's grown county by county by county. So there's non-trivial chunks of maize production in the US growing in the northeast, the eastern counties, and down in the southern counties. And look where it's all grown now. It's all gravitated into the upper Midwest, and it turns out that what I say, about 40% of the entire world's corn crop is grown in the US, and about 40% of that crop is grown within 200 miles of where I sit on a day-to-day basis. So there's huge spatial location in the concentration of production of corn, and similar, different patterns but similar principles applying with other crops that we're looking at. So we are down to some truths that some wise folks, wiser than me, wrote over half a century ago. So Abramovich said, well, what are we actually trying to measure here? We're measuring this thing called productivity, and essentially all it is can be taken as a structured measure of our ignorance about the causes of output or economic growth. It's literally no more or no less than the differential between measured output growth and measured input growth. Schultz attributing this idea to V. Grulich said, well, actually, from an economic point of view, it's not high productivity growth that we desire, it's low productivity growth. And what we like is an output-input ratio that's 1, so the optimal productivity growth from an economic perspective is 0, which basically is just saying that we actually do an accounting of all the sources of output growth by measured growth of inputs. So my view is we've got to start, if we want to stick with this notion of chipping away at the residual, thinking about these natural inputs in a much more explicit way using some new modelling tools might open some prospects for getting a better handle on our views about productivity.